You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Fabio, Scott Caulfield joining you once again. It's the 20th of July of the year 2025. It's good to see you folks again. A little bit of a hiatus as
it's summer.
It's summer, sorry. Vacations occasionally pop up. I was out in California for about a week. Scott was down in Bourbon country for a little while and is about to go spread the gospel of Crimson Cast on another continent. So, yeah. Scott, great to see you, and I'm glad we caught each other in the midst of our travels before we headed in different directions. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. I mean, a couple days in Bourbon country. It was awesome. Did some bourbon tasting, and then, taking the family. Go ahead.
Some time in Bourbon country next, right?
Yeah. Like, why is this wine so dark? What's going on? Give me my snifter. I'm trying to see what everyone else is drinking, and got into, I'm following the trends. Like, wine was big a couple years ago, doing seltzers. Like, hey, bourbon's big. I'll do that. It's like, I'll be in tequila in 2 years. And then we're taking I have some family in France, and so we're going to visit them and going to go visit France with the kids. So we'll see. I'm both excited and like unbelievably nervous to do an overseas trip with the kids.
You know what? I've done it twice. We've taken the girls over to Italy a couple of times, both times when they were relatively young. And it's great, actually. I can't vouch for France, but I can say, as much as people freak out about kids on international flights, ours did amazing. And they did a great job in a foreign country. Italy's kind of a cheat code if you've got small children. I will say this. The Italians love babies, especially in central and southern Italy, where you'll be at a restaurant and literally like the waiter will come over and pick your baby up and carry it around the restaurant while they're doing their job and leave you in peace to eat. And you'd think that would be frightening. And yet it's the greatest experience for the kid because they just have a great time. They're just like, what's going on? Wandering around. So I do recommend it, even though it might seem daunting to borrow.
The thing that's great about, Europe from a planning perspective is there's no cars. We're just taking the train everywhere. And then we're actually going to Belgium for a day, which I've heard rave reviews about. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll stay in Belgium.
Yeah. Hey, let me know how it goes. We really need like a Crimson Cast travel log where you
do that. That would be really boring. That's VIP stuff. That's
exactly. Yes. We're only going to bore the people that pay the most with that kind of content. That's amazing. Well, that's good. Well, yeah. Well, we had a great
time. Like on a train, be like, this guy kind of looks like Tom Coverdale. He's trying to connect everything to IU somehow.
I like that. That's good. Look, we had a great time out in California. Ran into some IU people out there, and really it's been a good July to not be in Bloomington or Indiana because, man, what is with the weather here? It has been rain, heat. It's like Burma out there half the time. We've had I will say, I don't know what it's been like up in Westfield wine country, but I can tell you, like down here amongst the Vox Populi in Bloomington, it has just been rain after rain after rain. I don't know that I've ever seen a late spring summer in Indiana that's been this wet.
Well, since we built the bubble up here, it's just been great. Just 72 and sunny every day. So once you get the synthetic environment going,
I can't wait for the legislation that they're going to pass to cancel the Hamilton County weather changing operation that you folks have been engaging in. You deserve it. You do.
Yeah.
Anyway, before we get started, just a reminder, folks, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, great IU apparel. We knew that there was going to be some coming. And it's exciting to see IU hats. I do not have the head shape, as we've discussed many times, Scott, to handle
bad headspace. But man, the logos, it's like, hey, you want the oval? We got it. You want the old 80s flying, pitchfork? We got it. It's like, I didn't even think about that combination. Like and then when they said hat drop, I'm like, like 2 or 3 hats. Like, no, I was like 10.
It's an insane amount of hats. Yeah. It's actually 8, but 8 is a ton of hats. Right. Like, if you wore 8 hats, I don't know when you would wear them all, but even my head shape, there's a snapback Final Four 87 hat. There's an IU men's soccer hat. And anytime we get anything men's soccer, we generally go for it. As you mentioned, the Fly and IU hat as well. All of those available at homefieldapparel.com. And if it's your first time there, you can use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. Again, that's homefieldapparel.com. Be sure to check them out on the socials as well. Also, just a reminder, we're on YouTube. Go check out our YouTube channel. Just search Back Home Network on YouTube, and it'll be where you need to be, as everybody else is kind of migrating over there. Also on Spotify. But we're excited that we've had such a great response on the YouTube channel, and we're 7,770 subscribers there, and actually 7,775. We just added 5 last night, so that's awesome. So go check that out. You can check out the other Back Home Network shows as well, including Assembly Call and the Doing the Work podcast, the Dribble Drive, Sideline Stories with Trisha Whitaker and Sydney Parrish. If you haven't caught that one yet, that's up there as well. All kinds of fun stuff on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. Check that out. And be sure to give us a follow on Substack as well, crimsoncast.substack.com. Scott, we are kind of still in that trough period,
right?
Topics-wise. There's not a huge amount of IU-related stuff to talk about. I mean, we've had a couple of recruiting hits. The big news, and maybe we can start with this briefly, Luke Goody does not get the waiver, so there are officially no ties between last year's team and this year's team. It is a completely fresh, blank slate.
So I guess not everything goes for IU. Like everything else seems to be like with the NCAA. It's like, you can do that, you can do that, you can do those kind of things. Like everything's allowed except for when we want what seems like a pretty logical medical waiver. Like, no, we're going to have rules now all of a sudden.
Right. No, it's shockingly, that's of course how it would work. But, going by the letter of the law, I guess this is how the NCAA has decided to handle that piece of eligibility. So it's too bad, so we only get Luke Goody in uniform for one season. And now IU starts kind of from scratch in terms of how this team is going to piece together. So I don't know that it necessarily changes a whole lot about our outlook on things, other than it's a depth piece, obviously, and it's the lack of a piece that can certainly shoot the ball. And it's very late in the cycle. Like, you'd almost prefer that news happen in April or early May rather than happening in July. But I guess this is where Indiana's at this point, and surely they knew that this was a possibility. So,
I mean, it sucks a little bit because, it would have been a good shooter, would have been some depth. But I mean, in reality, it's like you were looking at trying to get one more year. And, next year, well, I think we have expectations that hopefully it'll be a fun year, a better year. Maybe you're cracking the tournament. It's not like we're talking about a Big Ten title or a Final Four. It's not like this was the missing piece. And if Luke Goody was the missing piece of trying to make the tournament, then like it's like it's just a 1 year guess. Like in the end, when you take a kind of a step back, holistic approach, it's like, all right, this gives DeVries the ability to just really start from scratch. Not that Goody would have brought like bad habits in. And the frustrating thing is you watch Goody at the end of last year, and it's like you saw something there. It's like, man, if this guy was used correctly or in a different way, there's a lot more there. But let's not dwell on that because we're not going to see it next year.
I know. Yeah, it's I mean, I don't think there's really a lot of positives, except that it really does kind of fully force everybody into the new era. And it's going to be judged entirely on the merits of what the outcomes are this year. And as we've talked about, it's not a year where I'm expecting championships or anything like that, but you are expecting the team to kind of coalesce. And I think the one big item is that was one of the very few people that had power conference experience on the roster, and that's.
I'm just laughing because in previous iterations and so many coaches use the X, got to get my guys in trope, and it's like that coaches would use that for 2, 3, 4 years. Like, even the guys that are coming in, like I recruited him, but I really didn't start the recruitment. It's like that's gone. Like
this is all
DeVries can't come in and be like, man, I just need my guys, guys in here.
All your guys. It really is all your guys. No, that's a really good point. So we'll see what happens with all that. But we'll have a lot of IU football content and IU basketball content starting up here over the course of the next few weeks as summer or fall camp's going to get started. And football season is 5 weeks away. It's wild.
They're ready.
Yeah. So we'll be chatting about that. In fact, I will be out at Big Ten Football Media Days for the IU portion of things, and we'll have some content coming. Another good reason to subscribe to the YouTube channel. as
just gonna push it out there. Possibly an interview with an illusionist. We'll see.
I don't think I'm going to go get an interview with the illusionist. I don't know what I would ask him. I really don't.
That's what I want to see. Is just you stammering with an illusionist.
It is. No, it's hilarious because for those who aren't in on the joke, which I think is everybody, except the very few people who are getting
our text, then yes,
getting emails from the Big Ten. But the Big Ten emailed everybody that had credentials for Big Ten football media days and said essentially, hey, we've got these guests available if you would like to interview them. And I'm like, oh, that's nice of them. And then you go look at the guests and it's like there's an illusionist, there's like 5 stand-up comedians, and I'm like, well, surely these stand-up comedians have some ties.
Oh, Jerry Seinfeld, great, we'll get him on.
or like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, who has a very direct tie.
Exactly, yeah.
The Big Ten. No, not a single person with ties to the Big Ten or anything, and there's a couple of other people. So Scott, I told Scott about this.
Sorry, so
he's like, "Oh, you have to do the interview with the illusionist." Like, what am I going to say at that? Like,
about it, yeah.
I don't want to waste their time. Maybe somebody has good questions for them. Who knows? But anyway, I'll be out there. We'll have some content coming from there. I'll give you some updates. We'll hear from what IU coaches and players have to say, and might have a special announcement happening as well out there. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll have a lot more IU content.
Not what we're so off track here, but like, is it? I know you kind of mentioned this in one of our texts back and forth, but like it's a weird place to have Big Ten Media Day. Like I know you have teams out in the West Coast now, so you're trying to show like we're a national conference, but it is just Vegas just seems like such an odd place to do it. You think you're doing it just because people like to go there? And again, it's like we're trying to show we have like, don't forget we have teams out in the West.
Well, I do think a lot of it is, hey, we're gonna make the Pac-12 schools that joined the conference feel welcome. I will say it's a lot of extra travel for people coming from the Eastern time zone, and I guess the Central, because normally it's held in Indianapolis or held in Chicago. However, Vegas is such a well set up place for conferences.
Yeah.
So, the hotel is close to Allegiant Stadium where the Raiders play, and that's where the Big Ten Media Days are going to be. It is, I think, easier and probably a better setup than having it in Chicago. I've been to a couple of these in Chicago before, and it kind of stinks. Normally the hotel's a long way away from wherever the thing is. Same thing. I mean, Indianapolis is set up very well, but for whatever reason, they don't want to just. I think there's got to be some kind of innate jealousy about doing things in Indianapolis, even though it's set up so much better than Chicago. So this is a compromise. Plus, you do get, I think, a lot of media members who will be more excited to go to Vegas. And it's a 3-day event. That's the other thing that I'll note. Like, they're doing 6 teams a day over 3 days. So it's a really elongated event. And I really think that they're trying to turn it into more of a spectacle. I don't know if that's going to have a huge impact or anything like that. And I'm sure for most media people, they would rather just kind of dive in and get what they need and maybe not have it all on 3 days. But we'll see how it goes. It is a little bit of an odd spot, but I think a lot of things are going to be moving to Vegas in general. And that's going to be interesting to watch as we move forward, just to see. I think, Vegas has really gotten to a point where it's a much easier place to hold things than most of the major cities are, just because of the way it's laid out.
Big Ten football championship there someday.
Yeah. Well, and I think the Big Ten basketball tournament will likely, if it hasn't already been scheduled for there, I should remember this, but my brain is kind of phased out on the basketball tournament locations. They're all over the place at this point, but anyway. I'll let you know how it all is. It's fun.
Yeah, please do.
Anyway, we wanted to dive in on the first part of a 2-part podcast. This is more of the preamble version of this podcast. This was really generated off of a question that we got on the Back Home Discord server, and this was from our buddy Miller Time, and it really came out of talking through some of the ideas going on about, actually, I guess this was David in the 502 that originally had this, and I think Miller Time jumped in as well on this, so I apologize. Both of them really deserve credit for bringing up this topic, but it's about the relationship between colleges/universities and sports. And so the original question from David was, I think the podcast I want to hear is about the relationship between colleges and sports. It seems like the European model is producing better basketball players, and I don't really know anything about European basketball leagues. Why do schools have sports teams anyway? Is it because of money coming in? Is it because of a bigger problem? A bigger program needs high salary people to administer. Does a public university really need a swim team or a golf team? Should sports and schools be separated? And then Miller Time jumped in with, this is a very good topic. The college sports model is inferior to the European model in terms of developing talent, but a lot of the popularity of the college game stems from the connection people feel to various educational institutions. Hard to consider breaking that up and not expecting to lose some of the fan interest. So all of that, plus a couple of other items, which we'll probably get to in a third podcast, seemed like good things to talk about during the summer when we don't have a lot of other items to talk about. So we're going to dive into that. And Scott, I guess when I first started getting into this area as a researcher, as a professor, this was not an area I knew a ton about. And I know that you're kind of in that boat right now.
Right.
So let me ask you this. Have you ever wondered, why do colleges and universities have college why does athletics exist at this level? We hear about this so much, the American model is very different from everywhere else. Did it ever occur to you that that was kind of an odd thing, or a thing that maybe wasn't the normal order?
Not initially, going through college, it didn't. After college, it started to, and like you said, I'm in it not on the research or development side, but much more on the living in the youth sports section. So kind of the feeder system into college athletics. But it does start to. It's funny. We just with Bourbon Country, I talked about it. With you, bourbon's fine, but it ends up being kind of a marketing exercise. You look at it like this is all just marketing, and you start to think about, what is the difference between IU and Purdue and Michigan and Ohio State? They're all really good universities. Some of them focus on agricultural and medicine more than others, and some are more liberal. Some do more mathematics, like Purdue. But, where you get the identities of the university is through the athletic programs. And where you get the differentiation is through the athletic programs. And that's where people get their bond. And so what you start seeing, it becomes the marketing of the university. This is the best thing to market. With bourbon, they do it with fun names and cool bottles. And I'm sure if they could have a basketball team, like Buffalo Trace would be trying to get NIL deals for their best players. But you start to see, I've seen that much more in the last 10 to 15 years, just kind of having my eyes open and understanding the world a little bit more. So it makes sense, but I also, it definitely more on the youth sports side. We're not doing the best job of, I think, creating the best place to, if the goal is to maximize and have the best possible talent come out of our system, I don't think our system is set up that way. But I would say, I'm not sure that inherently that's not a bad thing either. I don't know if the goal of a society is let's make sure that we maximize our kids to get the best soccer players or swimmers out at every single era. Sometimes they should just look at sports as a fun thing. But I think we're in a weird spot where it's as a society, we're trying to figure out is sports fun, but it's gotten to be such big business that it's almost all right, maybe we need to maximize and grind this thing into dust and try and turn our kids into products that we can make sure we don't lose a great possible, lacrosse player in this mix. And let's, perfect this. The problem is you do that, and it creates other issues out of there as well.
You hit on a bunch of things there that tie directly into what I wanted to talk about in this. So I appreciate that. And like I said, we're going to kind of set up the historical aspects of it in this first show for about 30 minutes. And then we'll do another show probably next week where I want to dive into some of the day-to-day realities of this, which Scott is far more of an expert in than I am, given that Scott has kids that are in youth sports and I do not.
And I live in the epicenter of youth sports.
You do. You live on the San Andreas fault of youth sports.
Real Sports did a whole segment on the business of youth sports, which I can reference a lot, but they shot the whole thing at Grand Park. They use Grand Park as their example, which it is. It's one of the largest youth sports center in the country.
And that's a different version of one they shot 6 years ago, where they went to a similar place over in Ohio.
Yeah.
And it really highlights a lot of issues related to this that are worth talking about. But let's go back in time first off. And this is where I think we have to understand first and foremost where a lot of the concepts that we have lived under when it comes to sports really stem from. So first of all, I think it's important for everybody to remember that team sports and the idea of athletics as a pursuit that wasn't just physical exercise, games being played amongst each other in a formalized manner, is really not that old. It's really only about 200 years old.
Right.
And it stems back to the Industrial Revolution. And so you're talking about 1800 to 1840, like somewhere in that general range, largely starting in England, when you had all these people moving from the farms and the countryside into the cities to go work in these horrific factories in places like Manchester and London and Liverpool. And now you got a ton of people just sitting there and working 6 days a week who need leisure. They need things to do. So you start to get the development of these teams that are tied to factories. So I think most people maybe are aware of that aspect of the story. But what's interesting is how that starts to manifest itself as you get into youth and how youth are developed within sport. Because you just start playing sports in the early to mid 1800s.
Right.
You're not really thinking about, oh, this is going to be something that we want to train somebody for to earn a living off of. This was an extracurricular pursuit. But gradually you start to see crowds congregating around these games of soccer or whatever. It was obviously called football or an early version of it. And people start to see that there might be a business opportunity here. And so what ends up occurring over time is you start to get more organized teams. And in England, you start to get some of these things taking place at universities. And this is where I think it's important for people to understand that this is where the concept of amateurism comes from. I put a little handy graphic up there for the folks on YouTube. It just says amateurism. So you're not missing a whole lot, I promise you, if you're just listening on Apple. Why does amateurism exist in the first place? And why is amateurism so closely tied to the concept of playing sports at the school level? So you got to start with what were universities in England during this time period? And really, what were universities in the United States during this time period? And I've talked about this a little bit when I've talked about the business of college sports because they're intertwined issues. Universities in England and in the United States were not places that you went to unless you were in the upper class, unless you were male, unless you essentially already had your life's path laid out for you, where your family has enough money that you're just going to go be rich or run the family business that already exists. So universities were largely set up with the idea that we don't need to train these people how to get jobs, or we don't need to do vocational training. Instead, we're training these folks in the arts. If you've ever heard about the humanities, for those of you who didn't come and spend a lot of time in college, we're going to teach Latin. We're going to teach biology. We're going to things that have no practical impact on you being an accountant, Scott. Right. Or being an engineer. Maybe math would obviously have an impact on being an engineer. But the idea was we don't need to treat you as somebody that needs to learn how to make a living. You're already there. And so the pursuit of knowledge is really the pursuit of higher level knowledge, the whole idea of higher education. Well, sports fit right into that. And so at places like Oxford and Cambridge and all of these well-known English universities, you'd have a rugby team. You'd have a football team. You'd have a rowing team. And very quickly, what people discovered was that when the folks at universities that were playing those games were having to compete against folks that were working in factories playing those same games, the folks that worked in factories kicked everybody's ass because they did physical labor. And of course, as we know, that's essentially the same thing as training. So amateurism was devised as a way to keep that population away from the folks that were at the university level, who were doing it for the love of the sport, right? Who were doing it in pursuit of, education through sport, physical education. Right around this time period, this was when, the U.S. was constantly borrowing ideas from England. English rule had set up a bunch of universities along the East Coast, including places like William and Mary and Harvard and Yale and what became Rutgers. I'm not sure what happened to Rutgers in that equation, but they'd set up a bunch of these universities and they borrowed most of their ideas from English universities. The U.S. also starts to gather sports from England. And the first major sport that the U.S. collects was the game that became baseball. And baseball starts to be played more consistently in that period between the 1830s and the 1850s. The U.S. also brings in what at the time was still kind of the precursor game of soccer/football, which in the U.S. becomes American football. Same process happens in Australia. It becomes Aussie rules football there, and it becomes rugby in the UK. I'm just grossly oversimplifying all of this, but I just want to give everybody a picture of how this works. Baseball, because it wasn't being played at the university levels in England, becomes essentially almost like the factory worker sport in the United States. And it's the one sport that largely escapes what we're about to describe occurs with the rest of sports in the United States, at least at the team level. Football really is a university-tied sport. And so it ends up getting tied very closely to the idea of the university. In England, what's fascinating is during this time period, soccer becomes a professional sport. And it becomes a sport where very early on, they're like, we have to pay the players in order to get the best players. And it ends up existing almost entirely outside of the university structure moving forward. In America, almost the opposite happens, where football, the first football game famously, as they'll say, was what Rutgers-Princeton in 1869, I think it was. Football exists almost entirely within the university structure. Like from there, from 1869, it would essentially be another 50 years before a viable professional football league, the NFL, launches, because it doesn't launch until 1920. So I lay all that out just to indicate that the way that Americans think about sports at this level ends up being very much football and team sports along those lines are tied to the universities, and the universities are pursuing it from the perspective of it's part of the educational experience. It's not a for-profit thing that we're doing and that players are sharing in.
The thing that I'll throw in kind of tangentially, so I was a history major in college. I still read a lot of history books, but what I've always found interesting about this era is, when you talk about, the Princeton had a football team and Rutgers had a football team in 1850, and this is why sometimes we talk about like everything pre-World War II almost needs to be thrown out. Like the amount of how different a university was then to now just cannot be overstated. And I read a biography on like James Garfield, and I promise it'll connect, but he went to university, and I'm kind of messing this up, but he went there and like went as a science teacher, and they realized he's really good at math or something, and like within 2 years he's still getting his degree. He's also like a math professor, and then he graduates and becomes the head of the math department, like while he's still a student. It's just like this doesn't happen at IU, where you just have somebody who's like, that kid's really smart, I'm going to bring you on as a professor while you're a sophomore. Like but you realize how kind of embryonic these things were and how different it was. And so I always want to stress that like when you talk about college athletics at that time and like, oh, they had a football team, it's like, it's not like what we think of as a team. And as we've joked many times, you look at like, when Indiana had a great year in like 1904 or something in football, but go look at the schedule, because they're playing like, the Wabash Laborers Union, like the Indiana Alumni Association, they're playing wild sets of teams, because like, other colleges, some have this, some don't, and the level of student is also way different. So it's just not sure it totally ties in, but colleges and universities were so different at that time, just in the way they operated.
IU in 2024 had an enrollment of 48,424 students just on the Bloomington campus.
Right.
In 1900, the first year that IU played basketball at the varsity level, there were 600 students on the Bloomington campus.
That's like the current class of Bloomington South.
IU didn't get above the 10,000 student threshold until 1946. So, and that's a whole nother podcast that I'll do at some point, because there's an important historical tie there. But that, I think, is a really important thing to keep in mind. And it's a great point, is that what happened in the early days of universities is very different from what went on even 20 years later, let alone 50 years or 100 years or 150 years later. So you go through all of that and understanding that background, and it really lays out how the American model and the European models developed separately from each other. So the U.S. now has, with the establishment of football and eventually the establishment of basketball, as team sports that are tied to education, they enter into what I've always called the scholastic model of athletic development. And it essentially focused on the idea that the U.S. was essentially a closed system with the two primary sports that developed, football and basketball. And you think about it, not a whole lot of other places in the world play football still to this day. There are places that play basketball, but the growth of basketball internationally really didn't start to happen until after World War II. And so for a large period, basketball was invented, of course, in 1891. You're really talking about the first 60 years of the development of the sport. It's very much intrinsic to the United States. And so in both cases,
even internationally, it's basically just the Soviet Union. And I think they're using it just as a Cold War after. Like, it isn't really until 92 in the Dream Team that you see it really proliferate in other places. You look at just the Olympics, and it's the US, Russia are the only ones really competing in basketball.
Yeah, in Yugoslavia. And it's just and there's a lot that we could say about that too. But what it leads to is essentially two divergent models, because in Europe, what you start to see is obviously teams from different countries playing against each other when they play soccer. Now that also doesn't really get started until the 1900s. But what ends up happening is you've got a fully professionalized model that's also international with soccer, which leads to the need to develop your own talent in-house, versus universities who for a long time, like, that's the end-all be-all of basketball and football. Like, that's where you're going to play. So they're not looking at it like we have to develop this talent. They're bringing in the talent from various places through recruiting.
Or wouldn't you also, this is where I'll play student to ask questions, like, wouldn't you also say this is just the difference in like geography and the way that countries change, in that, there's really no professional system. And in Europe, it's like, France wants shows they're better than Germany, then better than Italy and all that. Here, you can't be like, all right, we're Canada, Mexico, and that's it. So in a way, the states kind of become the countries, and the universities become like the avatars of the states.
To some degree, yes. I think that's a huge part of things. It's not, I think, 100% of an analog, just because of how centralized the U.S. population is in the Northeast for the first 60 years of this process. But what's interesting to me is how it trickles down to the secondary school level. And this is really where this model ends up starting to develop. And so with this scholastic model in the U.S. that you're talking about, you've got young athletes participating in athletics programs that are directly tied to the education systems. And for those of you who are over the age of 40, this is the system that you grew up in as well, where, yes, there was AAU basketball, there was travel baseball, but a lot of it revolved around what you were doing at the high school level. The whole reason why the movie Hoosiers is what it is, I'm sure it's baffling to people from Europe who watch it. It's like, why are these schools competing against each other at the high school level? Why are there 16-year-olds with this much pressure on them? But you mentioned avatars for states. At the high school level, these high schools become essentially avatars for their communities.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things I always have to explain to people who aren't from Indiana. It's like, well, the sectional is probably more important to win than the state, because it meant you got bragging rights over the other teams in your county at that time period. Like, it's always hilarious when you walk into, I grew up in the Lafayette area, as many of you know. You walk into Lafayette Jeff's gymnasium, and they've got all of these like sectional championships from the 10s, 20s, 30s on these banners on the wall, or at least they did. I don't know if they still do. And I always laugh because it's like, you were the only high school of any size in the county. Klondike High School's got like 48 kids, and you've got 1,800. Like, that's not a fair fight, but that was how things were set up.
Well, and it's funny too, because like growing up in Bloomington, we had a pretty good football team, but it's like we were fighting against, Evansville, like Ben Davis, as we'd hit. And then you'd get to state, and it's like, oh, Fort Wayne Snyder, or like, Lake County, these schools, like, wow, this is like a different universe. And now it's interesting now, almost being on the north side of the Mason-Dixon line, where, you see teams like, my wife's a teacher at Westfield, and like they're going to state every year, or they're competing in that. It's like they're fighting against all of those teams to just get to state. And then it's like, you get there, it's like, oh, now we're competing with it. It's interesting how like that, the states almost get divided. But you're right. Like, the sectional really did matter, because that was the people you talked to when you were around.
One of the key things about all of this, and I think it's worth noting, is what this is leading to is the setup of a system where the institutions are the most important thing, because they are competing against each other year after year, whereas the athletes come and go, and the institutions can write off the athletics process as being educational in nature, which is why coaches at the high school level were almost always required to be teachers at the school that they were coaching at. It's why when you think about athletes and their ability to play, it was tied to, are your grades good enough to be on the team? And if you think about it, this is something I always ask students. It's like, why does it matter, really, whether or not someone has good grades and whether that should be part of why they should be allowed on a basketball court or not, or why they should be allowed on a football court or not? And it's just so heavily ingrained in the U.S. mentality that somehow education is tied to athletics that we've never questioned it for years and years. And it makes me wonder how many great athletes didn't get an opportunity to play, especially football and basketball, because their grades weren't good enough. And how many people were like, well, of course they shouldn't be allowed to play football. It doesn't really make a lot of sense on its face, because while I am certainly a huge proponent of the importance of education, those are not two things that are correlated with each other: athletic physical skill and the grades that you're getting in a classroom. And yet that is the predicate upon which athletic development largely existed for the longest time in the U.S.
No, it's true. And it's so interesting, because once you get to the professional level, nobody cares. Like it's just about can you play? And this is, again, not the best analogy, but if you, forgive me, it's not the best, but like, if you look at, players' ability to kind of manage their finances, which is a complex task, we'll use that as kind of an example of intelligence, which is not. So it's not, but like, so many players go bankrupt because they make bad decisions. They're not making, and like, but you kind of look at it as almost like that's cute, or like that's part of the game. Nobody thinks like, oh, well, I really, Halliburton had a bad series, but at least his 401k is doing great. Like, nobody cares about any of that. Like, it is just, are you look at the NFL, guys make all kinds of very poor decisions in life, but we don't care if they can run and score touchdowns. So it's interesting, once you get to the professional level, like, all of that washes away. So I've not thought about that before. It's really interesting.
So meanwhile, in Europe and in other parts of the world, they don't have college sports, and they also don't have sports at the secondary level tied to schools. There are clubs that one joins outside of going to school. I am oversimplifying, I will say that. But so much of what happens with elite athlete development in Europe, which is the primary system that we're going to compare against, and that system is what I call the academy model. I'm not the only one that calls it that, but essentially in soccer, in basketball, and in several other sports, these academies are oftentimes owned by teams. Right. So like Barcelona is a great example of this, or Real Madrid, or Manchester United, Ajax in the Netherlands. They have an academy where they'll sign players, and those players will come in and they will train and develop. And that's your next wave of talent, essentially. And the focus is on training athletes for their sport. School is offered as an add-on, but this is a place where your child is learning how to become technically proficient at the sport that they're in. It's really a lot about investment and the development of athletes, with the idea that you're going to bring a bunch of players in, younger ages, develop them over time in a particular style, and some of them will wash out, but the ones that don't wash out will either be great players for your team because you will have the rights to them having developed them, or you'll be able to sell them to other teams and make a profit. And that is what perpetuates that aspect of your business. And it's interesting, because one of the things you'll note in the arguments between America and Europe is, oh, Europe's socialist and America is capitalist. And yet it's a pretty ruthlessly capitalist system when you're bringing in young people, training them to be athletes, and then selling them once they get to age 18 if they're not good enough to match your particular setup. That's essentially how the European model has worked for a long time. It places a lot of different aspects of developmental approach on these teams and on the players, in as much as you've got them for a large period of time. And I think what's interesting here is when you talk about training and development, and this was, I think, what spurred the conversation to some degree on the Discord, in America, because of the fact that we still tie a lot of the athletics experience in these sports to the schools that people are going to, you almost have to offshore the technical development in many places because you don't have enough time to adequately develop players because you've only got a finite amount of time that you can spend on practices. This even happens at the college level where, you know, one of the big problems that U.S. college soccer has is because of NCAA rules affecting how often you can practice and for how many hours. You can't just go out and practice 7 days a week in a fully formalized team setting. Instead, you have to piecemeal it together and then hope that players are doing things on their own. And that extends down to the high school level as well. Whereas at this level, the training and the development and the skill aspects of things are built into the mix because that's what they're there for. Scott doesn't have anything else to say on that.
No. I agree. I'm thinking about it. The thing that that's kind of ringing in my mind is just how in other industries we have developed in the U.S. basically the same model. Like we're okay. It's weird because you would on one hand say, oh, it's just youth that we don't want to corrupt with capitalism. But, you know, again, the example is going in my head is just like the Disney Channel with young stars. And like early on, you know, Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake were part of the Mickey Mouse Club. And like you could think of Disney as almost like the corporate, you know, team there. And nobody was worried about, you know, Justin Timberlake's education. It's like, is he good on stage? Can he sing? And then we'll plug him into NSYNC and we'll get a cut of that. And it's like, you have just a feeder system of young, you know, entertainment talent, and we're totally fine. You still see that today with, you know, kids on set, and it's just interesting. In so many other industries, we've morphed into that same model, but yet with athletics, we're stuck in the same spot that we've been in.
And even with athletics, there are sports where we use a similar academy style approach. So tennis is a great example. If you're playing tennis scholastically, you're not very good. You know, if you're not at IMG or some academy learning tennis every day from a very early age, you're just not going to be able to compete at the highest levels. Gymnastics is the same way as well.
So of the team sports, baseball kind of got away from the college model because they built their own.
Well, I think that's the informative model. And it's where when I hear people talking about the need for the college model, especially people who are at the college level, I was like, well, we have to do it this way. We have to develop athletes this way. Baseball is a great example of a sport in the United States that developed an entirely different structure because it, as I mentioned earlier, was not part of the college delivery system of athletes. There's been college baseball for a long time, but that's not where most of the best players went until very recently. Like we're talking about the last 20 to 25 years. What we're talking about in baseball is essentially kind of a factory system where you go play baseball in high school, you get drafted at 18. Well, now you're playing professional baseball. We kind of treat that as like a summer camp in our minds for a lot of people, but for a lot of guys, that was going to be the job. And if they washed out, well, they were screwed because they didn't really have anywhere to go. And if you were good enough at the rookie ball level, you made it up to single A. If you were good at that level, you would make it up to the next level. And that was how that system was set up. And the idea was, well, we're going to get 8 to 10 years out of you, maybe professionally at maximum. And then you get replaced by the next group of people that are coming up. That's essentially how the soccer system, academy-wise, works in Europe.
And we own you the whole way.
Correct. And there's a whole separate trajectory that happens there. So, a lot of the model differentiation and what really prompted this originally was this idea of the European model and how it's affecting basketball development. That is something that's really fascinating because you also have to contrast it with the way that the U.S. has struggled to develop a really top level pool of soccer talent to compete at the highest levels across, the international stage of the game there. And again, a lot of it really comes down to this idea that kids need to be in school and that going and learning how to play a sport is not an acceptable way to go through your education. You're talking about those individual sports, which, as you pointed out, have a lot more in common with the entertainment industry than they do with the team sports industry. So what you end up with now is this situation where football is still football and nobody really plays football. So football system is just going to continue to be accepted. There's still not really even a particularly adequate secondary model for football within the US. Whereas in basketball, I think it's pretty clear now your travel team ball,
AAU,
whatever you want to call it, your AAU or equivalent is more important in a lot of ways than where you're playing in high school because of the amount of games that you're playing.
And you're starting, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen soon, but you are starting to see in basketball, like the Thompson brothers, and like you're starting to see guys who don't go to college, and there is kind of an intermediary training step like the G League and the Ignite teams. Like it's not great, and it's not where a lot is going. But to your point, like there's no one in football that does that. There is no G League or Ignite football. Like, but there's a world where in 15, 20 years, I could see that being developed more, because that's what I've always found interesting in the basketball point of view is if you're the NBA, what's more important, like going to Mexico City or getting a team in Ireland, or like, why do you want a bunch of, scummy agents and coaches, like people that you may or may not like, coaching all of your, like Cooper Flagg, like he goes to Duke, you like it, maybe you don't. Like, why do you want somebody else handling a property of yours right now? Like, wouldn't you rather just have him in your system and we'll just start getting him indoctrinated into the NBA and get like what baseball does? Like, I've just always been curious why the NBA, since they do now kind of have it, why they're not just pushing that harder.
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, I agree it's an odd thing that they wouldn't be more interested in getting engaged on that front. On the other hand, it's like, why spend money on something that you don't have to?
Right. Well, and college basketball promotes like Cooper Flagg becomes a product, whereas like guys in the G League Ignite don't.
Well, possibly. I mean, there have certainly been guys that have come through the G League and have become contributing stars. But I would look at it like this. You figure one of the big problems that the U.S. has always had in terms of an initiative to change any of this or a desire to change any of it is the fact that there are so many people in the United States. And just by the process of brute force elimination of, talent over time, you're going to come up with enough players at a high enough level from an athleticism and skills perspective that they've developed on their own that you'll be able to have a requisite level of talent. And now the NBA can go just draft European players. And you don't have to have your own system when people are still doing that for you. Maybe they're not doing it directly for you, but up to this point, you've had a situation where you can go get European players who have the skill development that you want in a variety of different areas and have them play on your team rather than having to develop your own academy. I mean, the G League, as it's known now, its original inception wasn't until the year, 2000 or 2001,
right,
when it was called the D League. It's only been 25 years since the NBA even had a developmental league at the professional level. We're still in the process, I think, of evolving towards them having an academy-style system that would exist at a level below that. Now, part of that, I think, is that there is an issue where how effectively are you going to be able to draw talent away from colleges, especially now that colleges are paying players. They were still paying players before, I think, is the big misconception. Like the idea that, we could just start this thing. I think as we saw with the D League when it started, you can't just start a professional league, pay guys $25,000 a year and say, hey, forego college, when they're probably earning more under the table and now earning more above the table than you would ever have gotten on that category. So there is an economic incentive here as well. But I think your point is really well taken, which is the problem that you run into and the reason why in soccer, in basketball especially, the academy system works better is that the development of athletes, while certainly ultimately profit-driven, is not profit-driven at the beginning, because what you have to do is develop skills and figure out who's actually got the physical talents, the mental talents, the emotional talents to play at a high level. Whereas in the U.S., most of these AAU teams and travel teams are started almost entirely as ways to get money from parents.
Right.
They are game driven, not skill development driven in most cases. Again, I'm overgeneralizing, but this is where a lot of the complaints that we'll get into on part 2 of this podcast come in. So you end up with teams where you pay a ton of money as a parent for your player or for your son or daughter to play a ton of games, where they may not actually be getting the skill development they need to accelerate to the next level. To get that, you'd almost have to pay extra to somebody else in a separate system to go have them help develop those skills, and many people do, all with the idea that then maybe they get to college and play there before getting to the professional level. It's a lot of extra steps. You do retain some agency if you are one of the very few that actually makes it through all of that. But for the majority of people, you're not getting the kind of deep skill development that you see with a lot of these European players, because that's what they've been trained to do from very early ages. It's why players from Serbia, players from Croatia, players from France, players from like countries that are much smaller than the United States are able to punch above their weight population-wise, because there's a lot more directed skill development coming out of these academies, because they're often run by professional sports clubs who have a system and a developmental approach worked out that they know works because they've tried it over multiple generations.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I want to circle back to, just not that you mentioned, I think is a really good point, is just the sheer population piece that matters there, where like, yes, Jokic came from Serbia and it's like they have a really good national team, but Jokic is one of like 2 Serbian players in the NBA. Like there's also just all right, like that's a one of one, and there's still 90% of the NBA is American players, just because we're just pumping people out. And same with France, like, oh my God, they look pretty good and they have Wembanyama. It's like, all right, well, they have Wembanyama. Like, great, I'll give you that. Name your next player. Like, Greece has Giannis. It's like, all right, great. Name me the rest of the Bucks is like made up of you. And that's a bad example because they're not good. But it's like, there's just brute. There's also kind of like, sometimes we do get into this, like, man, we need to do things more like Serbia. It's like, well, I agree with everything you say. I think there's a lot of issues with the youth sports that we'll get into the next part. Yeah. But I also think that's partially sometimes a little reactionary, where it's like, oh my God, Jokic is playing the right way and the Serbian team is great. It's like, well, that's also one player. And they also they play as a team, whereas this is also a completely different topic. Like USA basketball is also just a mess because they don't play together. And you just kind of still are putting these all-star teams together, which are just never going to be as good as a team that's been playing together when you add a little high-level talent to those other teams.
Yeah, it makes for a really complicated and fascinating thing, but it also, I think, highlights the odd way that we still mentally approach sports in the U.S., team sports. And again, this is very few people are knowledgeable enough about what goes on in tennis or gymnastics or some of these other sports to care that much about the plight of the individual athlete. And yet we get really caught up in this idea that people need to get their education while playing sports. And while I do think to some degree that is an important aspect from a humanistic perspective, it makes it a much different psychological and sentimental approach than what you see in other countries, because there isn't always that level of care. This is something that I've heard some U.S. soccer stars, like guys that have played at the World Cup level, talk about, where they've talked in support of the U.S. model, where it's like, well, yes, you get more skilled players out of Europe, but the players that wash out essentially are screwed at age 18 or 19. They haven't gotten any kind of a basis of anything other than sports, and they are in real trouble in terms of making it as a human being at that point. Now, that isn't to say that the U.S. is great at the education that they deliver to people by tying so much of sports to the educational process, but there is at least an attempt there. And by and large, your best athletes who make it at the high school level get to go to college and play because they're eligible to do so. It does, in some cases, set them up better for whatever they're going to do life-wise. It just tends to not develop players that are high enough from a skill perspective. And even in basketball, I think you could make the argument, I mean, the number of European players or Asian players that get drafted now, it's not quite a 1-to-1 ratio between American players that have gone through the school system versus players that are coming out of academies. But the fact that it's even to that level illustrates how poorly the U.S. system writ large, schools, travel ball, whatever, does at imparting the type of skills that you should need to be top-level players. I mean, the best players that generally get drafted in the NBA that are American-born tend to be players with just amazing athleticism. I mean, if you've got a modicum of ability from a skill perspective and you're LeBron James, like you've got an insane amount of physical gifts there that you're bringing to the table. Shaquille O'Neal, like that's not, you're going to be successful there. I don't want to say regardless, but you're likely going to be successful there just because of the physical gifts. And that's what you get when you are generating players in a population of 350 million plus people that other countries don't necessarily have at their disposal. So this is where, to kind of wrap this episode up.
Well, I just want to hit one more thing you said that just I'd never fully thought about, was just the difference between how we treat team sport players and single sport players, and how we don't really care. It's way old, but I just watched it, the 30 for 30 on Michael Chang, tennis player who won the French Open. I knew he was young. I didn't realize he turned professional at 15. Like he won a young tournament, went to the US Open as like an amateur and went to like the quarters, and like his parents were like, all right, great, you're gonna be a pro. And just like, he's like 16 or so playing. And they had this month, like he got a letter from Arthur Ashe basically saying, like, as a, Arthur Ashe, great tennis player, but as a minority playing tennis, like, you don't realize it now, but like you're an avatar for basically the entire Chinese American community. And I'm like, you need to conduct yourself as such, and people are going to be for you. And it's a very like poignant letter, as you expect from Arthur Ashe. But I was just thinking, like, damn, this kid's 16. Like, that's a lot of a weight to put on a 16-year-old. Not to mention you're playing, Yvonne Lendl, who are professionals. And they're out to eat your lunch, and they don't care that you're 16. But like, to your point, nobody looks back and like, man, that was tough on Michael Chang. She's like, you're pro now. Like, figure it out. And like, we do this in so many of these single team sports that it's very. You see it in Wimbledon this year. Like Blake Shelton's like 22. Like, kids are just super young when they. I mean, Shelton was like 17 when he started. But you have all of these kids who are under 18 when they're starting, and we're kind of okay with it. But yet, you're right. Once you get to college, it's like, oh man, that kid's 20. Like, he can't handle NIL. It's like you're letting a 17-year-old play Wimbledon.
Yeah, I mean, Jennifer Capriati was 14 when she went pro, and even
it turned out well. Just
turned out well. No, and it is, gymnastics is the one I always look at. I mean, you think about Shannon Miller at age 16 in '92, and I mean, all of these.
Ella Caroli, just a real nice guy who's going to take care of your daughters.
So look, so these are the things that all of this is in the soup, but I think it's a really fascinating place to stop. And we'll pick this up with our next podcast. We'll get into more of the details of how this works functionally. We'll get into some of the things that Scott's experienced as a youth sports parent. And we'll take some questions from you folks if you want to send them in either on the Discord or send them in via Twitter. Anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Good to see you folks once again. We'll be back with more Crimson Cast coming up this upcoming week from Big Ten Football Media Days. And we'll be back with our normal studio setup shortly afterwards. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.